Hello, my name is Cyprian. I'm a software engineer, part of the customer-facing R&D team, and today I will demonstrate how to use ALM Octane SHIFT to migrate data from Jira and its XRay plugin over to ALM Octane. ALM Octane SHIFT is a scalable, high-performance automated solution to migrate Jira projects over to ALM Octane workspaces. Micro Focus offers a assisted migration service from Jira and XRay to ALM Octane through the ALM Octane customer-facing R&D team. And to use this offer that Micro Focus gives out for free, please reach out to go.octane@microfocus.com to get started. Next, we have a few prerequisites before running the tool, and those are ALM Octane version 16.0.100 or higher, Jira version 8 or above, GRE 1.8.x or latest. We'll need a Jira user with admin rights and global permissions to access the users, and ALM Octane API access key with space administrator rights and workspace admin roles for the destination workspace. Now let's see what do we have in our migration scope. So the supported Jira and XRay entities for these particular migrations are pretty much all out-of-the-box Jira entities. That includes epic stories, tasks, subtasks, bugs, or any custom issue that the user might have created in Jira. Users, roles, and groups are also migrated. Versions and sprints, along with components, are also included in the migration. And of course, we do support the migration of attachments, comments, and relation between any type of relations between entities that Octane supports. And for the XRay test management entities, we support the test plan migration, manual, cucumber, generic tests are included in the scope of the migration as well. Preconditions, test runs, test execution, subtest execution, test sets, and the test repository as well. We'll talk about how the Jira and XRay entities are mapped to Octane entities in the following slides. This is a quick view to our ALM Octane SHIFT roadmap. So we are going to focus on our migration from Silk Central, a user interface for our ALM Octane SHIFT, and the migration from Zephyr, and so on. But keep in mind that roadmaps are subject to change and are therefore not a commitment to deliver our software product, code, or functionality, or to meet any specific timetable. Now let's check out the Jira and XRay to ALM Octane mapping. So this is the Jira to ALM Octane entities mapping. So a project is mapped to an ALM Octane workspace. Users are migrated over as users, groups as teams. The project customization goes over to the workspace customization, and this includes custom fields and lists. Components are migrated over as application modules, and epic are migrated as features. And of course, any backlog entity type, even components, can be mapped to other ALM Octane backlog entities. So for example, the components can be configured to be migrated over as a list instead of application modules, and epic to be migrated over as an epic in Octane instead of a feature, and so on. Bugs go over as defects, and custom entities are migrated as any backlog entity as you wish to configure. Versions are migrated over as releases, sprints go to sprints, and of course attachments to attachments and comments to comments. And now for the XRay to ALM Octane entities mapping, we of course got the same project customization that goes to the workspace customization. We've got test set in Jira XRay, and those go over as application modules. We also got test repository folders that get migrated over as application modules as well. We've got manual tests, generic tests that go over as manual tests. We've got the X-ray cucumber tests that are migrated over as gherkin tests. And we've also got preconditions that get migrated over as manual tests in Octane. And as the comment suggests here, each X-ray test that has a precondition associated with it will have a call to step to the migrated precondition. We've got test runs migrated over as manual runs, test plan as test suites, test executions as suite runs, sub-test execution as suite runs as well, and of course attachments and comments are also included for these entities as well. We also support the migration of relation between entities, so the relations between most entities you might have had in Jira are also kept after the migration. This is a quick graph of the supported entities, but we do support pretty much any Octane relation that is supported is migrated over. Okay, now let's go through the migration process and flow. So migrating to ALM Octane, as the migration from Jira and XRay to ALM Octane is not just about moving the data itself, but includes other aspects, such as migrating only the relevant projects, defining the best workflow, configuring the tool, testing and validating the migration, and so on. And there is some preparation that has to be done before the production data migration should start, so that it will fit the customer's business needs. Micro-focus customer success and the ALM Octane customer-facing R&D team will assist you throughout the migration process and beyond for a successful transition, helping you to select the right projects to migrate and the migration strategy you should choose, workflow and other manual configuration of your ALM Octane workspace, configuring and running ALM Octane SHIFT, testing the migration, DevOps best practices and guidance, CI integration, connecting to the rest of your ecosystem, and so on. And this is pretty much all the information I have for the introduction. And now we'll jump into the configuration of the tool. Okay, so first we'll configure Octane for the migration, and after that we'll start with the configuration of the migration tool. Okay, so first thing to do is to create a workspace. We'll name this Jira migration. We'll assign an admin user to it. Good. And now at the share space level, we'll go to API access and create an API access key so that our migration tool can access Octane through the REST API. Okay, I will name this migration key. And the API key has to have the workspace admin role assigned to the workspace we're planning to migrate to, and also it has to have the space admin role. We create the key, we'll copy it, and we'll add it to the description of the key for now. And that's all we have to do on the Octane side before we start the migration. Now let's see how should we configure the tool. So the migration tool comes with an Octane migration properties file and a mapping file. And this is the actual migration tool, Octane SHIFT, and it's a jar file. And to run the tool, you just have to double click this bat file. But before we do that, let's see how are we supposed to configure this migration tool. So we open up the properties file. moment. Okay. So as you can see, the first part of the properties file is the Octane endpoint, and first thing we need to fill in is the Octane user and the Octane password, along with the URL, share space, and workspace in which we plan to migrate to. Okay, now let's take the API key. We'll use the API key. You can also use the username and the password of an admin user, but it's much safer to use an API key and easier. Now we'll take the Octane URL, the share space ID, and the workspace ID. So the share space ID is 1001 and the workspace ID is 1004. Perfect. Next, we'll have to configure the Jira connection, and we'll start with the username. Make sure the username you're using is a project admin and has global permissions to access users as well. Then we'll need the Jira URL of the server. In our case, is this one. And of course, the Jira project key, which in our case is the XM. Next, we have some configurations that we should take into account if we are migrating into a shared space or an isolated space. In our case, we're migrating into a shared space. So what these three flags do: the first one, Octane migrate to master workspace UDF. If you set it to true, the UDFs will be migrated at the shared space level. If it's set to false, the UDFs will be only migrated at the workspace level from Jira to Octane. And the same goes for the lists and release and sprints as well. If you want all this data to be migrated under the shared space level, then you should set it to true. In our case, we'll leave it to false, and all this data will be migrated under the workspace level. Great. Next, we have some users migration flags that we might need to configure. So the first one is you'll need to set a default phone number for a user. So this property is mandatory only if you're migrating into SaaS, because Octane SaaS has this field mandatory, but on-premise doesn't. But what you definitely need to do is to set up a default password for all the migrated users. So you just set up a default password, and after the users log in with the default password, they should just change it. If you're using LDAP, you should provide the LDAP server ID, and the default value of this flag is null, and the users won't be fetched from the LDAP server. And for the users migration, we have a few migration strategies, and it depends on how many users you want to migrate and what users do you want to migrate over to Octane. So you have the option to choose between 4 options. So it's either all the users from all the projects will be migrated over to Octane. Assignable, only the users that appear in the assignee field in Jira for an issue that will be migrated will be included in the migration of the users. From file, so you can define in a user CSV file what users do you want to migrate over to Octane. Or from issues, so only the users used in the Jira user fields and authors of comments will be migrated over to Octane. I think this one will be the most common one used, from issues or assignable. But in our case, we use from issues, or actually we'll use all, just so you can see that all the users will be migrated over to Octane and how they look. But it depends on what strategy better suits your migration purpose to Octane. Okay. Next, we have the Jira filters. And if you want to use a filter from Jira, you'll have to create one. We'll do it later before we start the migration. Actually, I think we can do it now. Hold on a second. Let me just bring up the Jira server and we'll set up a Jira filter. Okay, and you'll just need to go to the filter and filter within your projects and use whatever filters you think suits your entity migration, and give it a name, save it, and this is the filter ID you'll need to use in this flag, Jira filters ID. You can use multiple filters as well. Next, we have the Jira relations. So there's just one flag here, and it serves a pretty simple purpose. So Octane does not support relations of type blocks, and the field block from Octane will be set to true for entities that are blocked in Jira, and the field blocked reason will be filled with the ID of the entity that is blocking it. And by default, Jira has only the relation with the name blocks. But if that name is changed, or if there are multiple relation types that should be considered like blocking, you can edit this flag and add more relation types. Next, we have an XRay related flag in our property file. So only the fields specified in these flags whitelist will be taken into consideration when migrating manual test steps. If it's left empty, all of the XRay defined step fields are included into the whitelist. So all of them will be migrated. On to the default section. So the first flag from the default section is the Jira default story name. So this flag is used because Octane only supports creating tasks only inside a backlog item. So to migrate the tasks from Jira that don't really have a valid parent, an Octane default user story is created and those tasks will be migrated under it. In our case, we named it default story and this is the default value. We've also got a default release in case a sprint is not associated with a release or cannot be associated with one. A default release is provided, and of course you'll need a default release start date and end date as well. The same goes for the default sprint start date and end date. So you'll need to specify both of these dates because in Jira having a start date and an end date for a sprint is not mandatory. So let's fill in these fields. We'll set in this date as a start date and this one as a end date. Then we'll do the same for sprints. Let's make it shorter. Perfect. Also, the default release end date and start date will be used for any release that doesn't have a start date or an end date in Jira and has to be migrated over to Octane. And yeah, the start date and end date are mandatory fields on the Octane side. That's why we have to provide a default value. We've got another property here related to the XRay migration. So Octane supports the creation of suit rounds only if they are linked to test suits. And to migrate test execution from Jira, they don't really have a test plan. An Octane test suite is created, and those Jira test execution are attached to it. And we gave it a default name, default test suite. We've got a sort of workaround for an Octane limitation. So at the moment, Octane does not support creating application modules with attachments or comments, or sudrans with attachments. And to keep those attachments and comments from Jira, a default requirement folder is created that will hold attachments and comments from those entities. If no name is specified, no default folder will be created, and the attachments and comments for application modules and sudrans won't be migrated. Next, we've got a property. If set to true, uses the default value in case an entity was not migrated, instead of failing to migrate the entity. And the next one, if set to false, it fails if a default entity was not found for the migrated entity. The next part of the property file is related to release and sprint strategy. So just like we had a strategy for the users migration, we have one for releases and sprints as well. So you can choose between the smart strategy, and if set to smart, each sprint will be attached to the release that was used the most by the most issues. If set to keep sprint, releases from the Jira project will be migrated with no sprints attached. All the sprints will be migrated under the default release. The Octane release field will be filled in with the default release, and the Octane sprint field will, with the value found in the Jira sprint field. If set to keep first release, releases from the Jira project will be migrated with no sprints attached, and all the sprints will be migrated under the default release. The Octane release field for the work item will be filled in with the first value present in the fixed version field from Jira, and the Octane sprint field will be left empty. And the last part, I think it's the easiest one from the migration properties file, and you can basically filter out whatever entity you don't wish to migrate. In our case, we have here pretty much all the out of the box Jira entities, which are translated into Octane entities, and the XRay entities as well. And if you don't want to include any of these entities, you should just set each flag to false. Now that we're done with the Octane migration properties, we only have one more file to configure before running the migration tool, and I will walk through all these flags and tell you what each flag means here as well. But just a kind reminder before we jump into the mapping file is that we have a really well documented Octane ALM Octane SHIFT user guide for both Jira out of the box entities, and if your project includes XRay, you should check out the Jira XRay to ALM Octane migration tool user guide as well. And these two user guides contains all the information you need before running the tool. Now let's get into the mapping file. So as you can see, the field mapping is made of multiple sections. So let's see. So we've got a field mapping, entity mappings, list mappings, entity type mapping, and status mapping. Now let's start with the field mapping. So as you can see, in our case, the field mapping is empty, and that's because the migration tool has a default mapping for all the entities from Jira, and all of them are documented in the user guide and can be overwritten if necessary. Let's just have a look on how they look like. Okay, so this is the entity type default mapping. So as you can see, task is mapped to story, story to story, bug to defect, epic to feature, subtask to task. And below we've got entity fields default mapping. So any of these mappings can be changed. So if you want to map a epic to an epic in Octane, for example, you can do it. But keep in mind that if you do that, you'll have to change the default. You'll have to change the entity fields mapping as well. Okay, now let's have a look on the entity fields mapping. So as you can see, this is the default mapping for the bugs that get migrated to defects in Octane. And these are all the fields that are migrated over to Octane fields or mapped to Octane fields. And it's important to keep in mind that all the custom fields are migrated over to Octane by default. This is the default mapping for stories, for tasks, map to stories, subtasks to tasks, epic to feature. And that's it. And we've also got a default mapping for the XRay entities. So this is the entity type mapping for the XRay entities. As you can see, we've got test sets mapped to application modules, tests, either Cucumber, generic, or manual. Each of them is mapped to a specific ALM Octane entity. We've got preconditions mapped to manual tests, test runs to manual run, test plans to test suit, test execution to suit run, subtest execution to suit runs as well. And of course, attachments are mapped to attachments and comments to comments. We've ran through this in our intro part, but just a quick reminder on how the entities are mapped. And you can see here the default entity field mapping as well for the XRay entities. For the manual tests, for generic tests, Cucumber tests, preconditions, test sets, and so on. So this is the default mapping, which can be overwritten and can be disabled if necessary. And that's the exact reason why the field mapping section is empty, because there's a default one that comes along with the migration tool, so you won't have to spend too much time mapping each individual field to an Octane field. So we've already done that for you, and if you wish to, you can disable it. Now I'll show you how to disable certain fields or map them to something else. Now to do that, we will turn for a second to the user guide, and under the field mapping section on edit the mapping JSON file, and the first one, the field mapping section, we can see that we have examples on how to modify each part individually, and if we want to configure any field, we've got examples on how to do it here, and every field is explained what it does and what's its role. Okay, perfect. For now, we'll take this one. Okay. And I'll paste it here. Perfect. And we need to specify the entity name. In our case, it's bug. We'll need to specify the Jira field name. So I was thinking of maybe disabling a custom field, and I'm here on my Jira project, and this is the list of the custom fields that are associated to my bugs in Jira. So I'll disable this field, for example, the checkboxes field. And yeah, I know that's its name. It's pretty straightforward. I'll add the name to the field here. You can choose if you want to change the name of, or if you want to map that field to a certain target field in Octane, you can use this field. But for now, we'll just disable this one, and by disabling it will put the skip migration to true. So the checkbox field for bug, if it has the skip migration property set to true, then it won't be migrated over to Octane. And as I mentioned, all custom fields are migrated over to Octane by default. But if you don't really want to move some custom fields over to Octane, you can just disable them, just like I did here. And if you want to do the same thing, for example, for stories, you can just copy the bug part, add a comma here, and change the name to story. And this field won't be migrated for stories as well. And you can do the same for any entity type. But first you'll have to specify the entity type, and it has to be included in the body of the entity type. And if you want to add multiple fields, you can do that too. So you just need to add a comma here, and for example, just copy this one, and let's take another field from Jira. So I don't know, let's take this custom field, number field. Okay, so this is another custom field, and we have disabled this one too. And when we do the migration, we'll check if so you can see that those fields haven't been migrated over to Octane since we set the flag to true. Now let's take another example for the bug entity and configure another field. So you can also take a system field like time span and map it to, you don't have an equivalent in Octane, so you can map it to a UDF, and you can just give the UDF name and label here in the mapping file if you wish to. And the configuration should look like this. Of course, this field is done by default. I just wanted to show you how it looks if you want to map a certain field to a different field I mean any other field that it's not in the default mapping. If you want to use a different field or name the field something else, like I don't know, time span from Jira, you can use this label instead, modify it like that. Okay, and that's pretty much it for the field mapping. Now let's move on to the entity mapping. I'll close the field mapping for now. Second, I had a missing curly bracket. I fixed it. Now let's see the entity mappings. So this section contains mapping for entities which exist in both endpoints. Mapping is possible for user and role entities. The user and role entities should have a default value. The default value will be used when entities that exist in Jira were not found in ALM Octane. If this default value is missing, the entities will not be migrated. So the default entries are available only for roles and users and are mandatory. And for the default user, the ID of any existing ALM Octane user can be used here. So you can map existing users from Octane with users from Jira, and the same goes for roles. Now let's move to the next section. Let's close the entity mappings and open up the list mappings. So this section contains mapping for entity types for lists which exist in both endpoints, basically. So if you have a list that already exists in Octane and you want to map its values, maybe you have different values, maybe those are Octane system fields and you cannot change those values, you can always map them. So you can see here that we have a mapping already done for the priority list from Octane, status list, which is mapped to a run native status in Octane, that's run status. So these are basically lists that had to be mapped for the XRay plugin. Okay, so you can basically map any value you might have in Jira to an Octane value, and of course you can you would need to give in a default value as well. Okay, now let's check out the entity type mapping. I'll close the list mapping and open up the entity type mapping. This section contains mapping for entity types which exist in both endpoints. A Jira type to be migrated must be mapped on ALM Octane entity type. So here is where you define each Jira entity to what it gets migrated over to Octane. So for example, like I said, if you want Epic to be mapped to a epic in Octane instead of a feature, you can do that. I think it's pretty straightforward, but anyway, I'll remind you that everything that I'm talking about is already documented in the user guide. It's explained with examples and it's pretty simple to understand. Now let's move to the status mapping, our last part of the mapping JSON file. So this section basically contains mapping for statuses or phases which exist in both endpoints. So you'll have to do this for every entity type you're planning to migrate. So you have to map the statuses from Jira to Octane phases. There's a default one already done, but in most cases, everyone has custom statuses in Jira and maybe even custom phases in Octane. So you'll have to map all of them accordingly. So yeah, for example, as you can see here in Jira, we have in progress, and in Octane we have in design. And keep into account to what entity type it's mapped. So you can know how you can do the status mapping. So for example, for precondition, we see that it's mapped to a manual test. So we'll have to check the phase for manual tests and the status for a precondition, of course, and then map it to the manual test phase. Same goes for generic tests and so on for bugs, epics, stories, tasks, and subtasks. But this is already done and it's pretty good for my project, so I'll just save this file for now, and we're done with the configuration of the migration tool. Now to run the tool, we'll go back to our to where our actual migration tool is, along with our properties file, and we make sure to save all the configuration files, mapping.json and Octane migration properties file. Now let's run the tool by double clicking on the run migrator.bat, and our migration tool will start and a command line will open up. Perfect. We have a warning that we didn't map 2 custom issue types, and those will not be migrated. So the migration tool has some sort of integrity checker that runs before the actual migration of data starts, and checks your mapping files, your properties files, and all the mapping you've done, if it's valid or not. And as you can see, we've got a warning that says that we didn't map new feature and improvement type from Jira, which is fine. We don't really want to migrate them. Those are some custom issue types and are not in the default mapping. So I'll type yes, and the migration will carry on without migrating those 2 entities. So the migration flow goes something like this. So first, the users are migrated along with groups, lists and custom fields, version and sprints, components, issues, attachments, comments, and relations. After the user migration is finished, you're prompted to check out if the user were successfully migrated over to Octane. In our case, I already did that, but we will review them after the full migration is done. We can see that a total of 23 workspace users were migrated over to Octane, and yeah, everything's fine. So I'll just type in yes, and the migration will carry on. And this is the last input you have to give to the migration tool. So you'll have to give an input in case you've got a warning or something might be wrong with your mappings while the integrity checker runs, and another one after the migration of users is done. Now the migration of the rest of the entities will start, such as lists, customizations, version sprints, issues, and so on. Great, so the migration has finished, and let's review the log together so we can see what happened. Okay, so we had a warning that we didn't map to custom issue types from Jira, and it's here. It's after the integrity check was done, and we had to confirm that it's fine and we don't want to migrate those entity types. Great. We had to give another input after the migration of the user was complete, as you can see here. And then the migration of the rest of the entities has started. The teams were migrated, the groups from Jira were migrated into Octane teams, lists, UDFs. You can see that we've migrated a lot of UDFs, 217 to be precise. We had 4 releases successfully uploaded to Octane. Okay, everything went pretty smooth. We had a few warnings because one of the issues we tried to migrate was related to the custom issue that was not included in the migration. So that relation between those two entities was lost because that particular entity was not included in this migration, which is fine. It's just a warning, it's a heads up so you can know. And you've got the entity ID and key of both entities. Okay. We've got another 3 similar warnings. So yeah, one was for a subtask, manual, and manual tests. The same thing because the improvement issue type was not included in this migration. I didn't include it because I wanted to show you what types of warnings you get if you don't. And it's the same for these 3 warnings as well. And then we've got a full summary of what was migrated. And we can see that no entity failed. It was a successful migration. Only a few entities need some updating, and some of them are in a warning state. And that's because of the warning we got above. And we can see that the migration took around 7 minutes and 40 seconds. And yeah, I think we can jump to Octane and review the migrated data. But before we do that, I also wanted to show you that you can always check the logs. So after a migration is complete, a log is generated and you can always check it. Now I've opened up both Octane and Jira, and we can see, I think we'll start by reviewing first the users, because that was the order of the migration as well. And you can see that we've got a total of 24 users in Octane and 23 in Jira. And we've got 24 here because we had our default user in Octane, so we already had a user created in Octane. So the user creation was successful. Now let's have a look at a certain user. And all of the users were included into the migration because if you remember, in the properties file, we used the migration strategy to migrate all users. So like I mentioned before, there are four different strategies, and all of them are documented here and in the user guide as well. But we used all just for this demo purpose. Okay, let's have a look at, I don't know, let's take, for example, Antonio G. Okay, so this is how the migrated user looks like in Octane. And yeah, this is the Jira user. Also, we can see that we have a lot of groups here. Yeah, a lot of group names. And we can also check the groups. that were migrated. So we've got 17 software users in this group, and you can check the members. You can see that all the users were assigned to these particular teams. So both teams and users were successfully migrated, and this is how it looks like in Octane. Now let's have a look at releases. Okay, let's go back for a sec on the Jira releases. Okay, I've opened up the releases on both Jira and Octane, and we can see that we've got a total of 5 releases in Octane and 4 releases in Jira versions. And some of them are missing start date and release date, and for those, a default start date or end date is used from the Octane migration properties. It's one that we set before we started the migration. And the default release is used to keep your sprint from Jira. So if we couldn't find a parent for these 2 sprints, we've assigned them to the default release, or it depends on the strategy you chose. Now we can take a look at the custom fields. So let's just take a single entity to review the custom fields. So for example, we'll take defects and we'll jump to the custom fields of those defects in Jira 2. The Jira entities in my project at least share pretty much the same custom fields, so it's okay. And we can see that we have in Jira a total of 17 custom fields for bugs, and we've got 22 in Octane. And the reason we have 22 in Octane is because these 5 custom fields were created to map Jira system fields to, and the rest of them, the ones that start with CF, those are custom fields from Jira, and there's 17 of them, and for each one of them the corresponding custom field was created in Octane 2. And for these 5 we've mapped Jira system fields to them. So fixed version, original estimate, remaining estimate, the source ID, a field in which you can find the original ID of the entity from Jira and the time spent from Jira. And the same goes for every other entity, like user stories. We've got custom fields created for them as well. And yeah, all the custom fields are displayed here too. And we've got custom fields created by the migration tool so that system fields can be mapped to them. And the same goes for every entity. For manual tests, for example, you can see we've got a lot of custom fields created for them as well. Okay, perfect. And I think now is the time to jump in our Octane workspace and review the entities that got migrated over to Octane. So under the issues backlog in Octane, we can find the migrated defects. I'll start with the defects because we only had 3 of them. And let's filter out the defects in this project as well. So we've got defect number 1, and you can see that it's linked to a subtask. It has some links towards some manual tests, a epic link, and it also has a sprint assigned to it, but no release. And yeah, let's open it up and see how it looks in Octane. And we can see, yes, that this defect is in progress, and in Octane is open because in progress was mapped to open. Okay, so yeah, so these are basically all the fields that are filled in, and we can see that it has the exact same sprint. It's assigned to the default release because all the sprints were created under the default release, so we can have the same release here as in Jira. We can see that the feature assigned to this defect is assigned to the Epic 2 feature, and we can see that here too because it's linked to Epic too, and we've migrated epics as features in Octane. Perfect. And like I said, this bug in Jira had a lot of relations, and we can see all of them in a nice graph here. So you can see that it's actually related to one manual test, a manual run, a should run, a task that we chose to migrate subtasks over to Octane as tasks because there's no subtask in Octane. So that a task would be its equivalent. And of course the epic link, which is a parent linkage. And yeah, the task is the children of this defect. I mean, you can see it in this tab as well. And yeah, it's a in progress task. The priority of this defect was not is not the same as in Jira because we didn't map this particular priority value, and the default value was used, which is low. Perfect. And it's the same for all other two defects. Now I think we should go to our backlog and review the rest of the entities. Now let's check out the stories. We'll take story 1 for example, and we have it opened in Jira as well. As you can see, we have multiple stories here. In Jira we only have 2, but tasks were mapped to use two stories as well, and we've got a default story that's automatically created by the migration tool in case you've got any subtask that gets migrated over to Octane as tasks and doesn't have a valid parent in Octane. So they're moved in the default story because tasks cannot exist in Octane only under a valid parent, like a story or a bug, or so on. Now let's have a look at story 1. We can see that it also has a couple of attachments. We can also see them here. It should have a subtask. Yeah, story 1 subtask. It has a pretty large description with some rich text. Yeah, and it has a all the description was migrated over to Octane successfully. We've got a sprint assigned to it and also a release. So release v2. We've also got all custom fields. We've got a lot of custom fields that were have values filled in for them and are also included in the migration. So let me just add all these fields to the form so we can check out the values of each field. Okay, so I've added quite a few of them. So you can see that we've got a version picker with 2 releases assigned to them, the source ID of the entity, the fixed version field. So this is a UDF created in Octane, so you can have 2 releases assigned because the default release field from Octane is a single value list and it's not a multiple value list, multiple value release actually. And we can see that all the custom fields were migrated over and populated accordingly, just like in Jira. Okay, let's have a look at the tasks. So we've got task 1 that got migrated over as a story, and this one should have a subtask assigned to it. Yes, so the subtasks are migrated over as tasks, as you can see. Perfect. And under the default story we have just a single subtask which should have been assigned to an epic, but epic were migrated over as features and feature cannot have tasks. And if we add here the subtask entity, we can see the Epic One subtask. That's actually this one's actually under an Epic or doesn't have a parent, and it's migrated over under the default story. Now let's check the Epic migration. So let's filter out the rest of the entities and select epics. So we got 3 epics that were migrated over as features. Oh, 1 second. Okay, so we got Epic 1, Epic 3, and Epic 2. So let's open Epic 1. Epic 1 has quite a few issues linked to it. So this one has as a backlog item the story 1, and new feature was not included into the migration, but this one should have some tests, and it does. It has a couple of tests and a test plan, and no, it doesn't have any attachments. Okay, it looks good. We got Epic 3 in Jira. We should have it here too in Octane, and Epic 2 as well. This one is also related to a lot of issues and has a couple of components assigned to it, and you can see that those components are used as application modules in Octane. So you can see it there. Okay. I jumped over to the quality module so we can see the component. So this is where the components were migrated in Octane, and if you click on one of them, you can see if it has any features assigned to it or not. So you can browse through components as application modules in Octane. If you don't want them to be migrated over as application modules, there's an option, and you can have the components migrated over to Octane as a list instead, a multi-value list. And to do that, you'll just have to go to your mapping file, choose the entity, so for example story, and add the components field and select a different target field. So, or maybe just a UDF, so you can take this part, for example, from the other issues, name it something else. It has to end with UDF in Octane. Okay, and the label you choose, components, Jira, and of course the field type. The field type should be option, and if you want it to be multi-value, you should use the property for is multi-value and set it to true. And this way you will have the components for stories at least migrated over as a multi-value list instead of an application module in Octane. Now let's get back to our Octane and review the rest of the entities. So far we reviewed the users, the groups, the versions, the sprints, the components, the epics, the stories, the bugs, the tasks, the subtasks, the custom issues, but we didn't include any of those. We just had a warning, attachments, and comments. But now we reviewed pretty much all out-of-the-box Jira entities, and I think we can jump over to XRay entities. So I think we can go to tests, to the test under quality module, and we have quite a few tests here. We've got the test sets migrated over as application modules. So if you have any test under a test set, those will be under that relevant application module. So let's take, for example, test sets and have a look at them. Okay, so let's have a look at test sets. So we have a test set 1 in Jira, And you can see that this test set actually has a description, attachments, tests assigned to it, comments. But as you know, test sets, like I said before, don't really have a section for attachments and comments in Octane. So application modules don't have those two fields. But as a workaround for now, until this feature is included in Octane, it's pretty soon. So in future versions of Octane, you will have attachments directly on the application modules. But right now we have a workaround for it, and we create a requirement document for it, and we link it in the description of the test set. And you can just click on it, and it'll already direct you to the requirement document, and you can see the comments, the attachments of the issue, and so on. And you can go back to your application module from here. And that's it. Next, we have the test migration. So both, actually there's 3 types of tests. So you can have cucumber, generic, and manual tests, and also preconditions, which are migrated over as manual tests as well. Now let's have a look on the manual tests. Perfect. So we've got a manual test with a data set. So I think we should check out this one. Let me just find it in Octane, and here it is. Also, you can add the source ID, so you can see it here. And this one is the XM18. So this one, manual test with data set. You can open it up. You can see that it has some steps. It actually has a call to step as well. It has some attachments, and of course, it's application modules, relevant ones. So this one is in test set 2, test set 1. Okay, and we've also got a comment for it, and it's a blank comment actually. Yeah, it's just a black bar. Attachments, we've got some runs. You can see them in the run tab, and yeah, 2 of them are skipped and 1's passed. Now let's have a look at the data set. So we can see the data set here, and we can see it here in Octane as a data table. So these are all the possible combinations, just like in Jira, and translated into Octane data table. You can see that we also have attachments in the steps of the manual test. So each step has action, data, expected result, and some custom field in it, and also an attachment, as you can see here. And you can open it up, but it's just a black bar. And we've got another bigger attachment here, and we can see it in the other step, and step number 2. Oh, hold on 1 second. Yeah, it's this one. You can see it in Octane as well. And we've also got a precondition assigned to this manual test, and we can jump right through it with a call to step in Octane. So this is a manual precondition for manual test 1. In Jira, you can see the associated preconditions. There's a precondition, yeah, here it is, precondition field and the manual precondition 1. But in Octane, we added as a call to step towards the manual test, as you can see here. So you can jump from the manual test, and you can jump during the run to the precondition, just like in Jira. Let's have a look at the generic test. We've got a generic test here too. So generic tests are migrated over as manual tests as well. So this is our generic test from Jira, and its ID is DXM15. And yeah, it's pretty straightforward. It's associated to a test plan and an application module. It has some test runs. It's a generic test run, and it's in progress. Okay, we've got the cucumber tests. So let's take one of the cucumber tests we have here. Let's take the first one. And cucumber tests are migrated over as gherkin tests in Octane. So you can find the script and the scenario in the script tab of the cucumber test in Octane. And if it has any runs, yeah, those are manual runs in Octane. So test runs are migrated over as manual runs. We've also got test plans. So test plans are migrated over as test suites in Octane. Oh, test plan. So we've got a default one for all the test, subtest execution without a test plan. So in Octane, all suite runs should be created under a test suite. Octane doesn't allow it otherwise. Now let's have a look at test suites. So we've got test plan 1. This is how it looks, and the tests assigned to it, so you can run the whole suite just like in Jira. And these are the test executions, just like here. All of them are in progress, none of them is finished, and the same name is kept as well. And yeah, so we've got test execution and subtest execution added to the test suites. As you can see here, yeah, this one has 2 ad hoc executions for two manual tests and a test execution without a test plan. So we can see those here. So it's these 2 and this test execution that were not run under a test plan. And as you saw, attachments and comments were also included. And also I've jumped over to the test repositories. I forgot to mention them. So the test repository is also included. So you've got the folder structure from XRay migrated over as application modules in Octane, and the tests assigned to the relevant folders. We can see all the folders were migrated. So all the test repository folders migrated over as application modules, and the relevant tests assigned to the corresponding test repository. And with this, I think we can wrap up our session. And yeah, feel free to give us feedback and let us know if you have any question. And if you are interested to migrate from Jira to ALM Octane, even if you have XRay plugin installed, we've got you covered. Just contact us at go.octane@microfocus.com. Thank you for your time.